police officers / investigators, etc. What are your holy crap, this criminal is smart moments? Guy found out that when a gas station lost its satellite connection, it automatically accepted all credit cards and would presumably process them later. So he climbed on the roof and covered the dish with foil to force it to lose connection, then made charges on a card that was cancelled. Story 2. Many years ago, probably 20-ish, my dad used to own this company, and one of his employees died in a car accident. In the next few days, my dad received the work logs and books and things that this guy would have kept with him, and that's when my dad realized that this guy was doing offline transactions, what they had to do when a client needed something after hours. I'm not exactly sure how it worked. It was something to do with the physical receipt layout, but he would overcharge X amount for the item, get to work, input Y amount paid, and the correct receipt, and pocket the difference. He had been doing this for years and years, and my dad didn't realize. Not exactly the smartest, but hey, he was never caught. My dad decided not to say anything to the family or anything like that. Story 3. I was an assistant manager at a little deli / corner store for a few years, and one of the employees bragged that he was getting a bag of weed a week from the store for free. Not to me, but to other employees. I couldn't figure out how. The numbers always matched up. He was also really successful with one of our couponing programs. It took me a while to figure out that our point of sale system would take the coupon without the UPC being scanned. In other words, the coupons were essentially cash. He was cashing out $80 a week in coupons. The kid was pretty smart. I only found out when I was doing the inventory and the books the same week. I saw that we had sold a ton of ice cream and thought, geez, I'm gonna have to restock the crap out of that. Then realized it was fully stocked and put 2 and 2 together. Story 4. My old boss was a major thief with 2 of his close friends in my small city. They all worked normal jobs at areas where they could talk to people, waiting tables and stuff like that. Every year on Christmas or another break-like holiday, they would case out frat / sorority houses, and while everyone is seeing family, they'd clean them out. Would go by storage units and look for things like cigarette butts around them and assume people probably practice playing music and store instruments there, since clearly they're there often enough to hang around and smoke. One of them got pinched when he tried to sell an expensive guitar at a music shop, and it was the shop owner's stolen guitar. Thinking quickly, he said how he bought the car from a guy named Steve. Gave the cops all info since he had been working with Steve at the restaurant waiting tables. Well, Steve actually died about a week before in a car wreck, so hey, no charges on anyone. They had ATVs, motorcycles, every video game console, TVs, instruments, etc. When they were finally busted selling a 4-wheeler to a sheriff's daughter, the other detective who investigated Steve told him it was a pretty clever idea sending them after a dead man. Then they all went to prison for about 4 years. This has gotta count as like desecrating someone's memory, right? Like morally reprehensible. But hey, credit where credit's due. It worked for them for a while at least. Story 5. In the 2000s, you could order a new credit card, not activate it, and then when you were on a long-haul flight, you could upgrade via the card machine to first class once on board, and then pay for the premium service. And when the flight landed and got internet connection, none of the purchases would be successful and you would already be out of the airport. I never understood how they couldn't find you afterwards with your passport and credit card details, but it was a big fraudulent scam that hit the newspapers multiple times. Maybe because apart from witness testimonies, there wasn't a sufficient paper trail to say that you were upgraded or had any of the expensive champagne or duty-free. Story 6. Long time ago friend of mine used to be in a professional car thief group. They would steal 70s, 80s model cars and trucks, strip them down, repaint and decorate, and then sell them. The state next to theirs had this weird thing where if a car was wrecked, it went to the junkyard, but the title was never marked as totaled / destroyed. It's been changed. So they would go buy these wrecks for next to nothing, get a clean title, swap the VIN, scrap the wreck at the metal yard, sell the newly VIN'd car at normal price to regular people. When I asked what made him quit, he laughed and said, "The local district attorney." Turns out the DA was looking for a Camaro for his wife, and said Buddy had a newly minty fresh one with low miles for sale. DA along with his sheriff buddies knocked on friend's door to take it for a test ride, at which point, friend crapped his pants. Not only was the Camaro hot, the other car in his garage 3 feet away was in the middle of a rebuild, and the truck out front had just been picked up. He was 100% convinced he was screwed beyond belief, but they took the car for a spin, loved it, and paid cash for the Camaro. Friend had a come-to-Jesus moment, saw the error of his thieving ways, took everything automotive at his house to the scrapyard, and then went and bought a legit car, all that very day. Story 7. A very clever criminal was stealing electricity for his nightclub in Liverpool. The power company knew something was happening because as soon as this guy took over, their usage was about a quarter of the previous user. They finally sent an old guy out to check the meter for problems. He discovered that they'd fitted a pressure switch on the door so that when it opened, the meter turned as normal, but as soon as you closed it, the meter would stop turning. 2 years they'd been investigating before he was caught. Story 10. Dude hit like 10 banks and many other stores, just wearing his pandemic mask and a hood, always on a very rainy or stormy day. Walked into each place and handed them a note. The note said that he would shoot and be certain to end them if they didn't give them all the cash they had. Ballsy, but I mean, they still haven't caught him, so damn. Pretty smart way to do it, I guess. Probably didn't even have a gun. What's funny is none of the banks ever triggered the silent alarm, and most of the stores called like 5 minutes after he left. He must have been pretty intimidating. Not sure exactly what the note said. Story 9. I'm not a police officer, but knew a doctor who is kind of a scam artist. It was a bit odd because he was a brilliant doctor and made so many people's lives better that people were so grateful they were always throwing money at him. Anyway, he ran a motor vehicle accident rehabilitation clinic, and he paid police officers a referral fee for any accident victims that they sent his way. It was something like $500 Canadian, which sounds like a lot, but each client was worth tens of thousands to the clinic. He also literally hired one of the guys who wrote the actual tax code. So with that guy as his accountant/lawyer, he would get away with so much slimy stuff. But I'm sure the revenue agency knew who he hired, so they were like, yeah, that guy's untouchable. Don't waste your time. Story 10. I'll tell on myself if you guys want a, well, that person kinda sucks type of story. When I was younger, 16 to 21, I worked at an Italian restaurant that paid me cash and kept out a portion for taxes. Anyway, I worked there for 5 years, and around year 2 when I totaled the amount of money they kept that they should have paid, I felt cheated, even though I was supposed to pay taxes. I had a vague idea on what taxes were, but not a great understanding. I knew enough to know that they didn't pay taxes on their business, though. Being immigrants, they had a grant allowing them to not pay taxes for the first 2 years they were open. Basically, I was mad they were scamming me even though I was also scamming the government. I was young and just didn't know it was as big of a deal as it was, and in my mind, I felt like if anyone deserved to keep the money, it was me, not them. I was basically unemployed for 5 years because I was never kept on books. Anyway, I started getting mad because there were only 3 servers including me, and I did a lot around the store. Ordering beer, food, writing the checks for the linens and other supplies, working 10 to 10 the 5 days I worked. I was severely underpaid. We used handwritten tickets and no point of sale system, so I started completely pocketing certain cash paid tickets. When I rang out the cash people, I would put it to the side and pocket it after they left and throw away both receipts, the kitchen's copy and mine. Also, when people paid card, I would have to manually enter the total amount paid, including tip, at the end of the night, and then enter the amount paid just for the meal, so they knew what the tip was. On bigger checks, I would change the total for the food and drink by a few dollars under the actual cost, so I got a bigger tip. The owners were negligent with their business, so they never knew. I would like to say that I never once stole from an innocent person or patron, just the people who were scamming me. Looking back, I can't believe how much authority I had, and how much they believed in me to not do the things that I was doing. I was so brazen and unafraid because I felt indignant towards them. Even on the day I rage quit, I wrote up a to-go ticket for a huge order like 3 XL pizzas, several of my favorite dishes and desserts, and when the owner went upstairs for his daily nap with a woman who was not his wife, I loaded up my car with cases of wine and all the food I had made for the make-believe to-go order. I didn't have to buy groceries for days. Even though they're scam artists in their own right, I do feel pretty bad about what I did and would never do it again. Story 11. Okay, not a police officer here. Worked in a corporate hair salon. We had a class on loss prevention at one time, and a lady came in to talk about what constitutes as theft with employees. One story she told us was about another salon located somewhere else where the stylists themselves were stealing money right from the company. Out of 5 stylists, 4 of them were scamming the company. Instead of running credit card payments through the corporate credit card system on the point of sale, they would tell the clients the credit card system was down, and they would have to run the card through a different system. Each of the 4 stylists had square devices that they set up like their own business, so the charges went straight to their own bank accounts. Then the service would either be cancelled or show up as a no-show. They finally got caught when a customer called corporate to complain about her service and was wanting a refund, and the transaction was nowhere to be found. The sad thing was, one of the stylists was the salon manager, who ended up going to prison for 3 years plus having to pay restitution. I'm not sure what the other 3 got, but I'm sure they all lost their jobs. Just blows my mind the things people will come up with. I would be so mad if I got caught like that. Like, what do you mean you called corporate for a salon to complain for a refund? And that's how I get caught stealing? Ugh. Not that I would do something like this, but just saying. Story 12. I'm not a cop, but my friend who worked at Best Buy used to do a pretty clever scheme. It's kinda messed up, but we were in college. Our moral code wasn't exactly honorable at the time. Usually during the holidays, there's a deal where if you buy a certain TV, you get a gift card, something like $10 or $20. This wasn't really heavily advertised, but a salesman would likely tell this to a customer to get them to buy a TV. Well, my friend wouldn't tell the customer. He would sell the TV and pocket the gift card. However, he knew that each gift card was scanned and tied that to the customer's transaction and him since he sold the TV. So what he would do is wait until he had a few cards and then get into a coworker's computer session, buy one large gift card using the smaller gift cards, and then use the larger card for whatever purchases he wants without it being tracked back to him. Never got caught, and I was always impressed he could pull this off. Story 13. My dad used to race cars in the 80s and he got caught by a police car. They turned on their lights and chased him. My dad was using NOS before that was super common and he flipped that on and took off, and then skidded into a random parking lot, crawled through the bushes and got home. Then immediately called the police and filed that his car was stolen. They already knew my dad but were like, "God damn it, we'll keep an eye out for it." "Oh, look, there it is." "Oh, thank God you found it." And he walked over and picked it up and drove home with it. They knew he was lying, but couldn't do crap about it. Story 14. My father ran film developing businesses and photography studios back in the 80s and 90s. That industry didn't age well. He hired a young employee who was a brilliant salesman, and the business grew into school pictures and wedding bookings soared, as did military events and running the color lab for several local newspapers. This guy could sell anything, but he was a horrible photographer and couldn't run a lab, so he stayed in sales. He offered to have his tax guy do the business taxes as a steep discount, so they changed tax preparers. Immediately after the quarterly employment and business taxes went off, this guy flipped. He refused to sell, yelled at customers, didn't answer the phones, opened film canisters, and ended up spoiling 2 weddings from the previous weekend which had to be restaged and reshot. Any idea how much it costs to restage an entire wedding? Imagine buying 2 complete weddings and paying to rent all new tuxes, rent the same space, and pretend to do the wedding all over again to get photographs, including buying airfare for family across the country. We fired the guy and were immediately sued. He paid his accountant on the back end to refile taxes as a partnership, not a sole proprietorship, and then took claim to half the assets of the business. He walked out with $250,000 in photographic equipment and color lab machines, sold his assets for cash, and disappeared. We found out much later that the same man, his accountant, and his attorney pulled the same scam with a car stereo company, a construction company, a muffler shop, and a taco franchise over the next 10 years. Very methodical and long game scam. Get in, get your accountant to get the business, file as a partnership without them knowing, get fired, and sue. He did that again and again, moving cities but keeping his attorney and accountant paid on the back end. Story 15. A few years back, my elderly neighbors had their home robbed. Her husband had just passed away and the obituary was in the paper with showing times and the time the burial ceremony was to start. These lowlifes looked up her husband's address in the phone book and knew exactly what time their house would be unoccupied. They took absolutely everything of value from this lady on the day she was putting her husband in the ground, and they never caught him. Yeah, this one is a little smart, sure, but you have to be the absolute scum of the earth to pull this off. It blows my mind that I can even think of ethical ways to rob people, because in comparison to this, there are ethical ways to do it. This is just disgusting. Not saying that robbing people is ethical, by the way, that's not what I mean. I just mean there are ethically better ways. This seems like dangerous territory. I'm gonna move on. Story 16. My dad is an attorney and had 2 clients. One who had an old Chevy Nova with a very well-hidden switch under the dash. He would flip the switch and the brake lights off, and then go in front of someone and hit the brakes. Won several claims from insurance companies. The second one was flying into small international airports carrying normal checked bags. Flew in from Canada every time, small puddle jumpers. Turns out what he was actually doing was smuggling immense amounts of coke. He refused to say a word to the cops or in his own trial. Just pled out and went to jail. My dad gets a single check to pay for his service of sitting and doing the plea deal, about half of his normal yearly earnings. Turns out the guy was smuggling for Pablo Escobar, and he would have been ended if he talked. Story 17. A bank in my hometown was robbed by a group of individuals during a historic snowstorm. We got 12-ish feet in 2 days, and early in the storm the bank was still open. Couple people just walked in masked with guns, robbed the place, and escaped on foot. Police response time was about 45 minutes at best, and by the time they arrived on scene the tracks were gone. Long shot, but pure genius. Story 18. Not my story, but my dad's, and I don't remember all the details. This happened maybe 3 decades ago. My dad worked bank robberies and other financial fraud cases. Most criminals he caught were not very smart at all, the way he tells it, but there were a group of guys who got involved in some kind of payroll scheme that managed to be successful, and anonymously embezzled a lot of cash. Like I said, I don't remember all the details, but it involved skimming a few cents off of each paycheck from tens of thousands of checks at a time on each payday for some big company, or companies. This was only possible because it was before the age when everything was digital as a given, and they got access to the physical payrolls, modified them, and then paid themselves out the difference, so that everything still added up on the books and nobody was likely to notice the 1 or 2 cents missing from their own check. These guys had code names inspired by their D&D group like Wizard, Troll, etc. Well, some years after my dad catches these guys, he's called in for an interview for another embezzlement case of some kind. They're doing the good cop, bad cop routine, and my dad was supposed to play bad cop, but the guy looked familiar. He kept glancing at my dad nervously like he thought he was familiar too. So he just stayed quiet until a few minutes later it clicked. He says, "Hey, wait a minute, I know you. You're the troll." The other agent in the room at that point just sat back while my dad, who was supposed to be bad cop, just starts shooting the crap with this guy, buttering him up, reminiscing about what a good case that was and how good a job this guy and his friends did before they were caught, got the information they needed, and closed another case. Now, just from what I know about tabletop RPG groups, I feel like you wouldn't want to commit crime with them. Like, every time you organize a time to get together and do something, it'll always just get pushed back. Story 19. A friend of mine did some time as a Marine officer a couple years ago. He got a call once about a suspected drunk boat driver, which here in Canada is treated the same as a DUI in a car. The difference is when the boat is docked, it is considered a house, not a motor vehicle. Therefore, you can drink on board while docked. He pulled up to the dock that the guy was at and found the guy with his boat tied up and a beer in both hands. But he claimed to have just opened the drinks after tying up, and since the only other evidence was a witness who heard the guy on the Marina's radio, they didn't have enough to arrest him. Story 20. My license plates were swapped with a car of the same make and model that was stolen. They then used the stolen car with my plates on them in a police chase. Nearly got my husband arrested for it until I showed them my car at the train station with the stolen car's plates on them. Cops were surprised they were that clever. Still got caught in the end though. Story 21. Totally not a cop, but a guy bought a truck and needed plates but was on the run and couldn't get things legally. Drove around until he saw a truck like his and wrote down the plate. Stole multiple plates with similar numbers and letters, combined them into one plate using tin snips, Gorilla Glue, and patience. Drove around with a clean plate for months before anyone noticed. Couldn't even tell what he did unless you were inches away from it. Story 22. My company does orders over the phone and offers refunds to customers who aren't happy with the service. Order-taking employee would take an order, process the customer's card, and then at the end of their shift, refund that customer, but put the refund on a debit card of theirs. The money would show up in their account immediately and our end-of-night books would balance, so it took us a while to catch this. We did catch it because we track refunds as a measure of customer satisfaction, and refunds were up that quarter, so we started looking for the reasons by calling customers and asking about it. We would get a lot of, "What refund? I didn't get a refund." Fired him, pressed charges. He pled guilty to theft, did like 20 days in county jail. Fast forward 2 years. I'm training a new manager. "Heather, here's how this works. You gotta watch out for this." She got it. A few weeks later, I get a call from our card processor. "Hey, we're seeing refunds to cards that haven't done business with you, and it's against our terms of service." I get the times and dates of the transactions, grab Heather and say, "Hey, we got a problem. Can you see who is on shift Tuesday at 3:30, Wednesday at..." "Sure, I'll get back to you tomorrow." So I'm on my way home and get a second call from our processor. "We've got the name on the account that is receiving the funds. Do you know Heather?" So I walked into her office the next day, closed the door. I said, "Heather, you got anything you want to tell me?" And she confessed. Said that she did it once to see if it worked, and then kept on doing it because it was easy. She'd stolen about $6,000 before we caught on, which made it a felony. This was a woman who I was paying $80,000 a year in the mid-90s. Single mom, smart. I figured it was drugs. I told her to take the rest of the day off and we'd talk about it in the morning. Called the police, had them arrive a half hour before she got there. The officers were in the conference room when I escorted Heather in. She confessed to them, ended up pleading guilty to felony theft. Don't think I have to mention I fired her that day. I did ask her why and she didn't really have a good answer. I still don't know to this day. Call me crazy, but I kind of get it. Like, you do it once out of curiosity and then you kind of get, like, almost addicted to the feeling of, this is free money, I can just do this, it works. I'm not saying that what she did was right or, like, she should have done it, but I do kind of get why. I don't even think there had to be drugs involved. It's just, you know, the happy chemicals in your brain go up when you make money, and this was another way to get money quite easily. Story 23. My best friend growing up is a detective and had a crazy story. A couple worked at the Walmart home office annex dedicated to the startup of the Walmart self-checkout for Level 1 tech. Store employees would work them to fix problems at the machines. A few months after they got fired, they started going to Walmart and scanning crazy amounts of stuff to self-checkout and walking out without paying with a receipt. What they did? They would put scotch tape on one of the scanners, so when the associate tried to scan their badge, it wouldn't work. The workers had to input their 4-digit ID into the computer to put up the assistance menu, and from there they would cancel the item. These two knew how the system worked, and would simply watch and see the code. When the associate would leave, they would get back into the menu and cancel the entire order. This would print a suspended transaction receipt, which looked the same as a normal receipt except it says suspended transaction at the very bottom. They didn't get caught for over a year. Story 24. Not a cop, but a newspaper reporter covering ongoing scams involving crooked tow truck drivers and body shops. It's a scam so lucrative that tow truck drivers are burning rival trucks and gunning each other down to protect their turf. Body shops pay tow trucks kickbacks to bring collision tows, which they'll use to bill insurance companies for unneeded or overblown repairs. Toronto area uses a first available system for accident tows, where the first tow truck on the scene gets the tow, which could be worth hundreds. So what they're doing is targeting high-end cars and hiring people to trigger collisions with stolen cars, all with an affiliated tow truck conveniently around the corner. Even cops are getting into it. I wrote about one Toronto cop currently under suspension who would not only tip off tow trucks about collisions, Toronto encrypts their police radio band, he would sell police radios to tow truck drivers and either report them as lost or have an underground radio tech on payroll to clone the radio. He also operated an online service that streamed Toronto police radio transmissions online for paying subscribers, owned several tow trucks that he leased out, and even owned a car rental business. The scam fell apart after police in north of Toronto did a traffic stop on a tow truck and discovered a police radio. That radio had the same ID number as one currently in service in the same division the cop worked in, and the police radio shop determined the tow truck driver's radio was genuine, but the one in police circulation was actually the clone. Story 25. Not a cop, but was a co-worker to one. Worked in the cage at a casino where all the money is. One girl, pretty new, kept having variances. Her drawer would be off 1,000 to 2,000 fairly often, so they started watching her more closely. We weren't supposed to help friends or family, but she would, and we're supposed to count out by hand the bills. Well, she ran the bills through the jet scan and handed a stack to her sister. Well, her drawer was $10,000 off. Turns out she put a $1 bill on top of a strap of hundreds and slid it to her sister. Needless to say, she was caught. She was also stupid enough to brag to other co-workers about how she'd soon have enough to travel, starting a business, when the day before she was complaining about being a poor single mom. How obvious could she be? OP, I think you've misread the title or something, cause, yeah, no, this criminal, not smart, absolutely foolish. And also, of all the places to steal from, a casino has to be the most dangerous. They watch their money like hawks. They are fiends for bills. Story 26. Not a cop, but I read the police reports. But at a place I worked at, the new accountant was doing the following. The manager was signing blank checks to pay the employees because it was easier. So the accountant was making out checks to employees on their vacations/days off, and then having her boyfriend go to check cashing places to cash the checks. They stole over $30,000 before she was caught, and she was caught over some very minor thing, where she tried to physically cover up the date with her finger on something she was showing to someone in the office, and someone noticed. They did an audit, and it was found out what she was doing. The manager was quietly forced to leave by the board of directors, but one of them got him another job out of state doing the same thing. It was all hush-hush because the board of directors didn't want people knowing about it. Story 27. Not a policeman, but I used to work with a guy who claimed that he used to work as a low-level mule for the triads in San Francisco. On one of his jobs back in the early 90s, he was supposed to steal a delivery truck out of a Sears parking garage. The truck had previously been loaded with, stuff, and his task was to grab it before it was inspected and then take the goods into the Triad's own distribution network. Now, this garage was a huge bay-style building capable of parking multiple delivery trucks. 0 windows. The roof and all the doors were alarmed and had cameras. So my buddy took an old station wagon down to the garage in the middle of the night, he put the car in reverse, dropped the hammer, and backed through the wall. No alarms there. Story 29. Worked as a trainee at an electrical company, southern Sweden, many years ago. The company noticed an unusual power loss between 2 nodes in their power grid. Couldn't figure it out for years. Eventually, they got suspicious about a local farmer, and could see the loss of power correlated with him running his watering system. Turns out he buried a big coil of copper wire beneath the high-voltage power line. By carefully crafting it, he was able to induce just enough power to drive his watering system. Story 30. Am a lawyer. represented a guy who crashed his car apparently while intoxicated. He ran across the highway and jumped a fence into a shopping area. The police located him at a bar there about an hour later, double-fisting beers with a whiskey back. No way for the state to prove he was intoxicated at the time of the one-car accident, only after. Case was dismissed and bullet dodged for him. And the people he could have hit if he was actually intoxicated, which, well, he probably was. Personally, I don't care what happens after. If someone's driving drunk, I don't care how they cover it up, doesn't make them smarter. They're still dumb as a sack of bricks to me. Sorry, just the truth. That's probably the hottest take you'll get on this channel, to be honest. But man, I hate drunk drivers. Story 31. Not a cop, but my crackhead uncle ended up doing 15 years for a scam he'd been getting away with for more than 10 years. My uncle owned a junkyard. He would buy a car, a really common one, and then he'd sell it for like $5,000. Then, he would go and steal it back with an extra key he had for himself from whoever he'd sold it to. He would take it back to his junkyard, swap the VIN parts out, and take the titles from identical cars that should have been destroyed. He would occasionally switch out which make/model he was doing this with, but he eventually got lazy and greedy, switching out less and less. He sold the same car this way 12 times, and eventually the cops were starting to figure it out because 3 different people who had their cars stolen said they'd bought it only a week ago, all from the same guy, and that guy would magically have an identical car but with a different VIN listed for the sale. In order to catch him, they had undercover cops buy the car multiple times, multiple undercover, and they took pictures of extremely small details to prove it was the exact same car. The messed up part was, my dad was a vice cop working chop shops at the time. He knew his brother was under investigation, and it put him in a really crappy spot, but in the end he just let them take him, and it worked out. My uncle got off drugs in prison, cleaned up his life, got married, and turned into a legit and legal car dealer. How do you go back to dealing cars? How does your reputation ever recover? Just like, yeah, I was in jail for, scamming people. Doing what? Selling, cars and stealing them back. Anyway, want to buy this Honda Civic? Story 32. I used to work for a retail chain. One of the store managers in a different state was found to be ripping the company off. He would process a transaction for a large ticket item such as a TV, print 2 receipts, and give the reprint to the customer. He'd then process a refund for the item via his receipt at a later date. When stock take came, he was fudging the figures in the reports. He got caught out by a security guard who became suspicious of the way the manager would act during the refund process. Story 33. As a teenager, I worked in a fast food restaurant. Some time passed and we got a new manager. Things started to go a bit weird after that. Shifts would start to feel really understaffed and the workload went up. It got so bad that someone must have complained to head office. Anyway, it turned out the new manager had fabricated other phantom members of staff who were invisibly on the rotor. Whether they were his family members or other bank accounts belonging to him, I don't know. So he was effectively fully staffing the restaurant from head office's point of view, overworking the staff who were there and paying himself 3 times over. Anyway, not long after this, he just vanished. Not sure if he was caught or not. Story 34. Worked in one of the Big Four, Australia. One of their biggest clientele is a very famous fast food restaurant. The story goes, a bunch of the restaurants had their EFT POS machines upgraded, but here's the catch. The people doing the upgrading weren't bank technicians, but crooks. No one checked with the HQ because, well, they don't get paid enough. So for 1 week, everything went into an account, and that got redirected into an offshore account, all to the tune of about $5 million. Here's the catch. Instead of admitting to their mistakes, the fast food chain basically told the bank to compensate their loss or they will take their business to another bank, and you guessed it, the bank paid. Sadly, my pay grade doesn't let me know what happened afterwards, and I only knew about it when I was doing a housing loan for one of the managers of the restaurant that got hit. Story 35. A guy I knew years ago had a habit of trying stupid ideas. He was involved with drugs heavily and knew a bunch of dealers around town. One dealer always kept a bunch of jewelry in his room and liked to show people all the gold he bought with his drug money. I guess he felt like a small-time big shot that needed validation. Anyway, the guy I knew was close with him, and he had been told the dealer was going on vacation. The dealer lived in a fancy apartment complex in town, so he figured nothing would go wrong with security cameras everywhere around the place. So while the dealer was out of town, the guy I knew rented a white utility van and got a jumpsuit, drove up, knocked on the drug dealer's neighbor's door, saying he was there for a routine heating and cooling maintenance service, crawled into the attic/service channel, crossed over above the drug dealer's apartment, went through his crawl space, stole his gold, money, drugs, and anything else valuable he could toss into his tool bag, and then crossed back over and left the building. Story 36. Smart crook story. Obligatory, I am not a cop. I knew a guy that used to be a junkie, and one day I asked him how the hell he paid for all his drugs. The guy was a world-class junkie. I remember because I didn't know that the stuff he did was even a thing. And apparently, it was super dangerous, and he did it for years. Well, it turns out he would go to Home Depot, buy a bunch of stuff, and get a receipt. This was when laser copies first came out. He would then go back to the store and steal a receipt roll from their store and print out a stack of receipts. He then would go to any Home Depot he chose, pick the items off the shelves that matched the receipt, and return them. He did it for years, always doing different stores all over. He laughed and said, "I got $1,000,000 arms." He also had HIV, so not that smart in the end. Story 37. I work for a large DIY chain. This is going back like 10 to 15 years. It was the woman working the returns till. When a customer returned an item from a receipt but had bought multiple things, instead of refunding the one item, she would refund the whole receipt, giving the customer the right amount of money and keeping the rest for herself. She was only caught because the company fraud squad noticed her till numbers always returned the whole receipt, and they came in to interview her. After sacking her, she asked the store manager if she could leave via the rear exit so nobody would see her. He said, "No, you can go through the normal exit like all the other thieving scum." Story 38. Obligatory, not an officer, but I'm a historian. And going through records about an investigation my professor did, I began to read about a guy named Juan de la Cueva. He was a Spaniard merchant from the late 1500s. He moved to Peru and started doing a whole bunch of shady business. The thing is, if you probably know what people used to say about the early modern ages, especially the Spanish Empire, you probably think that fierce, aggressive, and barely legal capitalistic schemes were not a thing yet. Well, that's not really a case. This guy Juan literally opened a bank so big and important it had offices all over the Spanish Empire, from Chile to Panama, Mexico, the Andes, and Seville. We went through the records with this professor, and the things he did immediately made me think of the Wolf of Wall Street, but in the early 1600s. He had colluded himself with a guy that stole silver from the king's silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia, and illegally traded with China and India. He started selling Chinese silk in Mexico and Panama, despite navigation to Asia by private companies being supposedly illegal, and only being allowed for the king's fleets. He also transported illegal goods from Spain's enemy nations into the Spanish Americas. Any shady business we could imagine, he did, even causing a massive inflation due to counterfeiting silver currency that was basically copper or lead coated with silver. His empire was so big that every single merchant in the entirety of the Spanish Empire was, in a way, connected to his company, from Philippines to the Netherlands. Eventually, a series of risky business ventures that ended badly caught up with the guy. In 1635, he had to file for bankruptcy after a failed business with a ship that sunk with a lot of his money. The thing is, people caught wind of this even before he had filed for bankruptcy, and many of his partners and people that had deposited money in his bank started trying to withdraw. Eventually, people were forming outside his offices and his HQ in Lima, Peru. Even riots started because the bank would not open, and people couldn't withdraw their money. So many people had deposited money into the bank that it was simply impossible for him to give them their money, since most of it he had invested in other ventures expecting returns. The viceroy had no idea what to do. Nothing of this sort had ever happened before, and people were furious. They wanted his head, but this guy was well connected. The viceroy even asked if he could get his rich friends to bail him out. Many of them had already loaned him money for other ventures. Taking the opportunity, many of them inflated the loans Juan had taken and ended up suing him for up to double of what they actually gave him. The guy was a smart and fierce businessman, on par with the risky business experts of today's Wall Street, but eventually fate caught up with him. And unlike today, back then the government wouldn't bail out a corporation. Juan was finally put on trial, at first for having irregularities in his business, then for all the money he owed. As the investigation continued, more and more shady business and illegal stuff was uncovered. Many of his business partners were also tried after he snitched on them in order to get a reduced sentence. Some even got hanged for it. In the end, due to his cooperation, he wasn't executed and was placed in prison for life. The economic crisis that ensued was devastating for many. Even government institutions had their money in his bank. Just goes to show that wherever there's a system, someone will be out there trying to exploit it. And admittedly, this stuff seems to be a lot easier not in the modern age. Computers really ruined it for scam artists. Sorry, guys. That being said, it's always nice when one of these stories ends up with the guy getting caught. I don't know, it feels like a storybook ending almost, but it's satisfying for the brain, isn't it? Story 39. I met a quick change artist when I worked for a bank. He shortchanged several people before coming to me. I refused to play his game, but I've never seen anyone this good. He was doing quick math and exchanges I'd never seen before or since. He would even lose money on some swaps and ask people to balance their drawer because he thinks they shorted him. Then he proceeded to do a few more swaps and make it back after they thought he was being legitimate. He's actually still used in training materials at my local bank last I checked. If you ever run into this, only ever return what they give you. If they ask for 20 in fives and give you 45, return it to them as 45 in any denomination you want that includes their small amount. They tell you to keep a portion, don't. Give it all back at once. My method is to never take it from the top of the counter. They know the cameras can be used to show their fraud that way and will take it all and leave. 90% can be avoided by only accepting cash from customers and checking their ID before exchanging money. They will leave and not even try on most of those. Story 40. Usual suspect gets arrested in a light credit card fraud operation. While searching the house, detectives find a handwritten book titled My Life in Crime, which provided first-hand accounts of many crimes he had committed over the years, some known, others unknown. Anyway, with that kind of confession sitting around where a cop might find it, you'd think he was stupid. Soon after his arrest before trial, he escaped custody. He jumped into the Connecticut River on a moonless night and went under. Nobody saw the fellow swim onto shore and disappear into the night. It was years later now. He had eventually traveled south. There he got into some gambling stuff and eventually opened a bank out of his hotel room, which was not a real bank. Then, when he or one of his mules would hit the table, the money changers would call the bank to confirm the players had enough money to cover. Of course they did. They were stealing money from casinos all over El Caribe, the West Indies, and Central America, and then gambling with it. Needless to say, the games are easier when the player uses the bank's own money to cover losses. Dude lived a posh life, mixed with celebs, political circles. Then he got caught for real and did hard time. Used the time in prison as if it were school. Came out with a degree. Then he got extradited back to New England to face charges on the light credit card fraud enterprise he had left behind. Smart criminal for sure. And hey, maybe a genius. Story 41. Former crime reporter here. One of my first stories. Large electronics wholesaler in upstate New York. Large truck backs to the loading bay at the start of the day. This is when cell phones were not as ubiquitous as they are today. 5 guys jump out, lock all the employees in the lunchroom, use the forklift on site, fill a semi with high-end electronics, and drive away. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of merch stolen in less than half an hour. Employees eventually break out, call the cops, but the truck is long gone. Never caught. Some of the electronics eventually turned up in NYC. Story 2. Homeowners in a luxury house in a good neighborhood. They're on vacation. Moving truck pulls up. Legit markings. Guys in jumpsuits empty the entire house. Couture clothing, tens of thousands of jewelry, high-end appliances, the works. Apparently this was a stolen truck and a team of smart, opportunistic thieves. No one questioned the theft because the truck was an actual moving truck. Well, in that second story, stuff got moved all right, just not to anywhere that the people who owned it would have wanted it to go. Story 42. Not a cop, but a fairly well-known story from my last major manufacturing company. Apparently an engineer at another factory set up a shell corporation to buy fake parts from. He would regularly place purchase requests for parts that his equipment needed, and the area supervisor, who could approve up to $2,000 of purchase requests, would then approve them without looking too far into it. Then he would ship boxes filled with fake junk to himself at the factory, shipping and receiving would get it, and finish the invoice/paperwork, thus paying himself, and nobody was any bit the wiser. The trick was that this guy had been in that department for many years and basically knew everything about the machines in his area, and the shift supervisors tend to rotate around every few years. Give the parts believable names and then set them up in your inventory system as critical spares or frequent wear items, and it handles itself. No supervisor would ever question it, since it became so routine, and he had so much more machine knowledge than the supes that even when they would start out and ask what it was, he could feed them a load of believable BS because there were a ton of other legit things that go the same way. Apparently they figured he embezzled a few $1 million over the year before getting caught. Story 43. Got one that I'm pretty sure is money laundering or tax fraud for sure. A business or person buys $500 of something from a nonprofit, say Girl Scout cookies for example. They get a receipt saying they made a purchase from a nonprofit for that amount. Then they turn around and donate the $500 worth of goods and get a receipt for $500 worth of charitable donations. Come tax time, they have 2 $500 deductions they can claim, but they're only out $500. Story 44. Ops officer in the Navy was in charge of upgrading the computers for his IT division, and tasked in IT2, E5, to purchase 40 Dell desktops. Dell had a $250 rebate after purchase deal. After the purchase, the chick went in and submitted the rebate request for all 40 computers for a total of $10,000 she intended to keep for herself. The division officer found this out when he attempted to request about the existing rebate, and was informed by the company the rebate had already been issued under the IT2's name for the order. Yeah, she got demoted and kicked out after a lengthy investigation. Story 45. My grandfather arrested a guy for counterfeiting $20 bills back in the day. He mentioned the only reason they caught this guy was because a clerk noticed he had been given 2 bills with the exact same serial number. He firmly believed that if it weren't for his slip-up, the perp could have been in the clear for a while since he lived rather modestly. Those were the only details my grandpa was immediately aware of because the Secret Service took the perp into custody not long after, and they completely took over the investigation. Story 46. I used to work at Walmart a few years ago, and if you've worked customer service doing returns, you know what a no-receipt return scam is. Basically, somebody would either steal an item from one Walmart and go to another, or just straight up take something off the shelf and walk up to the desk with it. They would claim they bought it a few days ago but lost the receipt, and the store policy was to accept their return as long as they had a valid ID. I don't know about other ones, but ours made a rule that you couldn't get cash back for no-receipt returns, only Walmart gift cards. Along with that, we made a policy that you couldn't exchange gift cards for cash. Well, some smart person figured out that if you put a gift card in as a form of payment on a self-checkout machine, entered the number for a propane tank refill, and then canceled the transaction, it would spit out cash instead of refilling the gift card. No idea why it was just that one item, and nobody had any idea how long they did that, until some bored security guard watching the cameras noticed a pattern. Story 47. Years back, I worked as a district employee at a large grocery chain. I was in charge of loss reduction. During a meeting at a store, I was talking to a store manager about a report he is supposed to print weekly and check for high-dollar returns from employees. He told me he doesn't really look over it. He has his bookkeeper keep an eye on it. My response was, what if it's your bookkeeper that's showing on the report? A month later, the bookkeeper was taken out in handcuffs and the store manager was fired. Story 48. Not a cop, but this was a brilliant bank fraud scheme by 2 tellers in my small hometown. The 2 ladies handpicked 6 bank accounts with lots of transactions that they noticed were not closely monitored. Construction companies with lots of expenses. This was in 2004, so before online banking was the norm, especially for blue-collar construction guys. They read their clients and knew exactly who was vulnerable to what they were scheming. They would falsify withdrawal documents for small amounts between the accounts, rotating through them on a daily basis. Then they would pocket the amount. Nobody ever noticed the small amounts missing. To my knowledge, they upped their game and set up a business account with the bank and started paying themselves from their victims' accounts so it looked legit. There aren't many details reported in the news for obvious reasons. This went on for over 2 years and they embezzled $1.4 million. Nobody would have caught on, but their downfall was because they started to take a lot of trips to Las Vegas and were buying new cars after they got cocky. People started noticing their new lavish lifestyle based on a bank teller salary, and that's what triggered an investigation. The mastermind behind it pled guilty, cooperated, and provided all details to police. She got 8 years in jail, 5 years probation, and was ordered to pay back the balance. Her co-worker pled not guilty, idiot, and the judge threw the book at her. What makes this sad is one business owner was quoted in the local paper saying he wouldn't be exaggerating by saying the money stolen led to hungry mouths at dinner, and eventually losing his home. Bad money management on his part, but very sad. The local bank barely stayed afloat after the whole ordeal. $1.4 million was a huge embezzlement in my little town. I always love hearing these stories of they wouldn't have been caught, but, and then hearing the most ridiculous garbage afterwards. It's like, okay, so they were going to get caught because this was in their brains to begin with. Like, come on, you think nobody's going to notice that you're spending a lot of money that you shouldn't have? What is even your cover for that? You are this close to greatness, and by greatness I mean making blue-collar workers go hungry and lose their homes, which isn't greatness. Story 49. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, a guy I knew went interrailing around Europe for a couple of months. Took a new credit card, used it sensibly, pays it off when he spent more than a few quid. When he got to the town he was getting the ferry home from, he bought lunch in a cafe, then maxed it out. Leather jacket, watch, jewelry, high-end stuff. Then gets on the ferry. Mid-channel, the card goes over the side. As soon as he's off the boat in England, he calls the card company. I've lost my card in France. Last thing I bought was lunch. Provided the receipt from lunch and they believed him. No follow-up at all. Doubt it would work now as a scam. They would check the times, and CCTV was less common, and it was all paper, not electronic. Story 50. Used to be a park ranger with LAPD. Rolled up on a homeless guy with a crack pipe to his lips inside a park daycare area, fenced in. It was after hours and he had broken the gate to enter. In his possession were tools and a half trash bag full of weed. I detained him without conflict. but he failed to have any form of ID or provide his name. Our unit rolled to the nearest station to have him processed. Part of the process for booking is to remove your weapons and secure them before entering the booking area. Our unit was citywide and we had special lockers in the vehicle to locker our weapons. I was doing paperwork when we arrived, so my partner, more senior officer, was ready first. He opened the door to the suspect and the suspect immediately supermaned out of the car onto the pavement. The suspect starts screaming like he is being beaten. Other officers in the parking run over to assist. Dude is clearly in pain from the maneuver, but no one wants to touch him. A rescue ambulance is called and the watch sergeant for the station walks out. Now, it's like 1 a.m. and there isn't any senior staff up right now. The watch sergeant doesn't want to accept the patient until a medical professional clears him. Problem is, suspect denies to be seen by ambulance. This happens, so we bring him to a local ER. Suspect refuses treatment. Oh, now what? We call our watch sergeant. He calls the captain. We call the station captain, and no one knows what to do. So we're told to take him back to where we found him. It's not worth the lawsuit. So we do. And I decide the next week I'm not fit for law enforcement. If you're reading this saying, "Oh, you don't sound like a cop," you're right. I'm a software engineer. But I was an emergency hire park ranger 8 years ago. Think deputized in the movies with a short placeholder academy. I wasn't a police officer, but I respect those who are. There are police officer park rangers, and I was only able to operate illegally with one of them endorsing my citations and arrests. Yes, I was basically a park ranger sidekick. Hey, yet another valid example of why body cameras are important and good for law enforcement to have. I know more commonly it's to be like, it can prove that officers are abusing their authority or whatever. Super true. But also cases like this, like even for the officer side, it's just a good idea. Proof is just always nice to have. Story 51. Australian. Not a cop, but my little hustle used to be like this. Walk through grocery store into a big shop. Scan and pay for everything at self-serve checkout while holding the most expensive tray of steaks/cheeses, etc. under my left arm. Once other groceries were bagged up, I'd walk out still holding the expensive stuff I didn't pay for under my left arm. In 10 years I've been asked to walk back and pay twice. You just act like you've come off a 12-hour shift and you just forgot, so you can't possibly be charged with theft. You're just an overworked blue-collar worker that's half asleep. Story 52. Not a cop, but I heard this story through the company I worked for. Was a metal recycling company. Staff were allowed to take modest, small amounts of material for personal use if they needed it. A nice little perk. Process was to fill out a form of what you wanted to take, attach a photo, and give to your manager to sign off. And that was your gate pass. Paperwork to show security on your way out. Security were contractors and didn't really know the metals. There was no real rule around what you could take, just applying fair common sense for not ripping the business off. For example, you were allowed to take some copper pipe, expensive, as long as it was within reason and for your personal use. Anyway, there was a bloke who was asking for bits of material pretty regularly. Nothing expensive, just steel. But wasn't being very descriptive on the paperwork. Just things like sheet metal or pipe. Shortly after stocks of copper started being wrong at stock take, they couldn't figure out why. One night just so happened the yard manager stayed back late, did a walkthrough of the material storage area, and he happened upon this bloke who that day requested some more material. Found him loading the back of his car with a few 100 kilograms of copper. He'd been doing the paperwork right, but taking photos of the material he wanted in the foreground of the picture, disguising the fact he had taken the picture with the copper in the background. When questioned by security, he would show the paperwork that just said pipe, and the copper was in the back of the photo. He'd then go to another scrap dealer and sell the material. Manager says, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Few 100 kilograms of copper, by the way, is $3,000 to $5,000, and he just replies, "You signed off that I could take it." Like hell I did. Security called. He was marched off-site, cops called, and he was investigated for theft and fraud. He'd stolen over $30,000 of copper and other materials. Dismissed from the company, and the security guards had to be trained to spot valuable material. They also changed the process for taking material to require a state manager to sign off. And most of them are jerks and just say no. And here's an example of one jerk just ruin it for everyone. I'm sure that perk was really nice for a lot of people for personal projects. But all it took was one dude abusing it, and now it's way harder. That sucks. Story 53. My husband worked at a grocery store for many years when he was a teen. He knew of a clerk who would help his buddy steal hundreds of dollars of product from the store, just with some sleight of hand at the register. He would hold a 10-cent packet of Kool-Aid in his hand, and he would pretend to scan all the items, so each item scanned would only be 10 cents. But to the cameras above and to anyone watching, no suspicion, because the scanner would beep each time. Not sure if you ever got caught. Story 54. My office was in a strip mall with a storage unit facility behind it. These crooks rented a unit so they had access to the whole facility. They'd go to someone else's unit, use bolt cutters to get off the padlock, steal anything worth money, and then replace the lock with the same brand and put stuff into their own unit for a bit. The facility was walked through daily and looked all good because the locks were all there. And who visits your storage unit daily anyway? So it took a while for anyone to notice missing items. We are a Navy town, and so a lot of families would get a unit for a short time while their housing situation was settled, so lots of good stuff to be had. They got caught when other towns in the state figured out they'd already been hit, and all storage facilities were notified. Also, I think they used their real names. Story 55. Many years ago, I worked IT in a Fortune 500 company at one of their largest regional offices. We had over 500 people in and around the area. We obviously would need to order computer equipment and miscellaneous IT hardware. The company also employed temps/floaters that would come in to help handle a variety of administrative tasks. We were short-staffed in the department, so occasionally we would get some assistance from the temp. Once we needed an order to be placed due to an IT emergency, so we told the temp to call our IT vendor rep and place the equipment order. We followed up a couple more times when things got busy, as it was just administrative work, before online ordering took over. What we didn't realize was that the temp was also a floater for the mailroom, and the accounting department. So the temp got smart and made a series of phone orders to our IT vendor and shipped equipment to a new office we were opening up. Some servers, monitors, PCs, things our account rep would be happy and eager to supply for a new office. Well, when the invoices came in, you guessed it, he would just go through the inbound mail and swoop up the fraudulent invoices. Or if he happened to be working in another department, he'd catch the invoices during his near-daily stint in accounting, who were always short-staffed. So a few weeks go by and we noticed the temp has not shown up for work. And we also got some irritated calls from our account rep saying we're like 60 days past the due on a bunch of invoices. Some frantic back and forth between the vendor and accounting reveals we have no record of the purchases. The vendor faxes over a bunch of invoices to the accounting department, and that's when we realized none of the orders were authorized by IT, and the delivery address was some completely unknown location. Of course, the person who placed all those orders, around $100,000, was the temp. So we provide all this information and file a police report, and nothing. They're basically not interested in pursuing because apparently it's not a big enough deal to them. Personally, it made me furious that we thought we could trust a coworker only to have that person be so shady. But ultimately, perhaps the temp wasn't smart as much as we were too dumb to realize the guy was in key positions where he could defraud the company without anyone ever realizing due to the different roles he was in. Story 56. Not a cop. I used to be a very stupid, selfish kid. In the late 2000s, I worked at a specialty retail store, part of a local chain. Made decent money because I was the top salesman of all the locations and part of my pay was commission. Eventually, I learned the passwords for all the managers, so I had the ability to access and edit any information in our point of sale system, including editing or deleting transactions, inventory, even shipping and receiving info. I learned that when customers bought consumable items that I knew they wouldn't be returning and paid cash, I would fully process the transaction and just go back and delete the transaction later, pocket the cash, and edit the inventory to match what the customer took. I would write down transaction numbers that included returnable items that had a time limit on them, and go back a month or 90 days or whatever later and do the same thing. Had to be careful to pay attention to case quantities and minimum order amounts because if we were sold out of something that comes in a case of 10, I couldn't do this with one of those items unless it was a very high volume seller, or someone would notice it missing, even if the inventory and transactions and register all matched. Pocketed an extra $200 to $500 per week for 2 years before I moved away for school. Story 58. I worked at a popular grocery store when I was a teenager. My friend and I schemed up a plan to steal alcohol. We would either drink it ourselves or trade it to our other friends for goods that they would steal from their jobs or just sell it. I'm not sure how it is at other grocery stores, but alcohol would come into the store directly from the manufacturer if it was a large enough quantity. If it was just a 6 or 12 pack here or there of non-popular stuff, it would come in on a standard truck. For some reason, the store let me, a 16, 17-year-old, handle stocking alcohol. First mistake. Second mistake was that the person who took in the alcohol usually worked like 5 a.m. to 2 p.m. and stupidly left his new password for the inventory on a post-it. I took advantage of that and would log in using his credentials and not on a computer. I would use one of those handheld scanners where I would be out of sight on a camera. My friend and I would basically adjust the inventory when one of us worked at the same time as the inventory guy, usually weekends, and then take the trash out, but bury stolen alcohol under the actual trash. Gross, but it was covered, and it was really the only way we could could get it out the door. We only really found out by testing it out that the camera near the dumpster had a blind spot if you drove against the wall of the store to the back end of the dumpster. We would then crawl under the dumpster where we hid the alcohol and then drive away with the goods. My friend and I made the mistake of adding someone else into the mix. He got super wasted on a day off once and came into the store and tried to steal alcohol outright. He didn't snitch on us, but apparently gave up enough details for store management to start paying very close attention to us original too. We stayed quiet for a little bit, but as we got closer to graduation, we tried it again and got busted immediately. Fired on the spot. They threatened legal action but were gracious enough to let us go since we were both bound for college, which I'm still thankful that they did. Otherwise, life may have been a little tougher. I don't regret it though. I'm 31 now, and still have this amazing leather wallet from trading woodchuck cider to a classmate, and made a decent amount of cash for a high school kid off of it too. Story 59. I worked as a corporate field inspector for a pretty big hardware store. My job was to make sure that the remodeling job that was sold by a salesperson was being realized properly. The problem was that the salesman didn't have any ownership of the actual job. It was just handed off to a contractor, but all of the material was sold through the salesman. They would upcharge and sell things not needed or delete important infrastructure parts if they got the sell to go through, commission-based. It was a nightmare of regularly seeing contractors not have what they need or just having too much. Contractors got a bunch of free stuff and the salesman made higher commission. Half the time the company had to eat most of the bill because it was so over the top. The salesman had no responsibility for the actual product they were selling once the customer left the store. Story 60. Heard this from a retired police officer. This happened way back. When they did small street-level drug busts, they would use bigger marked bills so they could be easily traced. They would send in an undercover cop and he would buy X amount of drugs. Dealer would give him the drugs and change. They would arrest the dealer, document the drugs and cash they found on him, and the marked bills. They would try and do a sweep, so they hit multiple drug dealers a day. Thing is, no judge ever asked what happened to the change the drug dealer gave to the officer with the drugs. So they just kept it and split it up at the end of the week or two long sting. Story 61. I'm not a cop, but rather an employee who is told of some genius employee who was fired, later jailed, for stealing a lot of money from the lottery. A girl who works at one of my gas station locations when there was lottery would void an item and then still manage to give back the same amount of change to the customer as if nothing was voided. Then, at the end of her shift, she would take out all of the money that was added up and put it into her pocket, then buy herself some lottery tickets. She got away with it for a while as she was always even on her end of shift report, so it didn't appear that any money was missing. Then my manager got suspicious due to the number of voids. The employee eventually got so addicted to gambling that she would take from the bottom of the pack and play those tickets, which is still pretty smart as none of us are ever going to check every ticket to make sure it's there, even if its last one is on 6 or 2. The only reason she actually got caught is because my manager called her out on being $100 short in her register, and then the employee came in and offered to even it out by handing the manager $100. Logically, no one is going to willingly give up $100 on the spot just to help yourself out, especially when there's enough suspicion that you're stealing. Story 62. Not a police officer. Several years back, a local mall closed. They tore it down for scrap and usable equipment. One day, after many days of construction crews moving in and out, a crew with all the correct gear and a crane comes in and takes the industrial air conditioners off the roof for resale. Now, they were not with the company doing the demolition. As far as I know, they got away with it. And for our last story, further proof that with a shiny vest and a clipboard, you can get in anywhere. Oh, and a hard hat. Really, what I've learned here in this thread, though, is if you want a criminal to incriminate themselves or just say what they've done, just post an Ask Reddit thread. Like, 50+% of these were not police officers. They were criminals saying, I did exactly this. Surely that's not a good idea, right? I mean, there's so much random stuff on the internet, it's not like anyone's gonna parse through it all and find you specifically, but still, if I were doing an investigation, I might just throw out an Ask Reddit thread just, as a crapshoot. Anyway, as I said, that was our last story, so thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.